I know we're going back to Franz Hals here, but I wanted to talk about this group portrait that he did of the Archers of St. Hadrian because I'm going to use it as a sort of counter contrast when talking about our next starred piece by, we're going to get to Rembrandt. I just wanted to talk about his Archers of St. Hadrian. This is another one of Franz Hals's traditional group portraits where he's posing them one at a time, and again, it all just kind of looks very posed and very artificial. He tries to keep a sort of element of candidness by having some of them engaged in things like conversations or looking at each other, or some looking at the viewer, but in general it does come off as being sort of very artificial, like, we need to have one token guy pointing down over here, or one guy reading a book but not actually reading it. And it just, I think there was one of Rembrandt's students who said that you could decapitate them all with a single blow, that they're just all lined up right with their heads in a row like that, and you could just cut their heads off. Compared to that piece, Rembrandt's Company of Captain Franz Banningkock, you can learn the full name if you wish, that's fine with me, but you can also call it the Night Watch. It's probably the more common of the two names. Technically, Night Watch is a misnomer, so we'll learn about that in just a moment, but you can call it that because it's just so widely recognized at this point as the Night Watch that I wouldn't mark you wrong. Rembrandt also, for the purpose of memorization, is one of those artists that you can just refer to by his first name. Rembrandt van Rijn, or Van Rijn, depending on who you talk to. I think it's Van Rijn, I'm pretty sure, according to Dutch, that's how it should be pronounced. He's so well known and famous that we just call him Rembrandt. This is his idea of a group portrait. And for just a moment, I know that it's going to detract from the quality of the image, but for just a moment I want to put Rembrandt's Night Watch next to the Archers of St. Hadrian. So this is for an archers guild that Frans Hals painted. Rembrandt's Night Watch is supposed to be for a private militia in Amsterdam. Rembrandt does several things very differently from Frans Hals that gives his piece more of a theatrical element, or maybe more of a candid nature, something that Frans Hals was trying to capture but didn't quite do so very effectively. As I said, his looks very posed compared to Rembrandt's. Let's look at Rembrandt's closer again. What Rembrandt did was, yes, he took a portrait of each individual, and yes, he sketched them individually, but instead of trying to pose them in the scene and sort of move them in and out of the scene as he was working, he would sketch each individual's faces a couple of times until he got their characteristics just right. And then he would go back to his studio, and then he concocted this enormous, at 12 by 14 foot long and high painting. So he is doing a group portrait, and they are true portraits of the individual, but he's painting it in a studio. And because of that, it has this sort of more illusionistic quality to it, that we get the idea that we're gazing at a scene as it's taking place and not just looking at a very artificially posed picture. The scene that's taking place, it's a company of musketeers, and they're lining up for a parade. So they're not going to war, they're just going to a parade. They were militiamen too, so they were supposed to be sort of the guardians of Amsterdam, the city where they were working, but they never actually really saw battle. These were more like gentlemen or cavaliers, if you will. They never actually would have had to go to war. They were more upper class than that. But he is trying to paint them in all of their fancy livery and outfits that they're wearing, with their fancy guns and with their drums and all the sort of pomp and circumstance that you see going on around here. So they're preparing for a parade, not for battle, and strictly speaking, this painting was supposed to have occurred during the day, not the Night's Watch as it has been called. The reason why it got that name is because the resin that Rembrandt used over his oil paints to kind of seal his oil paints and lock them in, that resin turned his painting or his canvas darker. And they cleaned up what they could, but you don't want to end up over cleaning a masterpiece of this magnitude, so they kind of left it darkish. You can still get a sense for his subtle tonalities, his composition, and his gift at portraiture. There are a couple of vocabulary terms associated with Rembrandt, one of which, or I guess the most important of which, well, one being group portraiture, which we talked about the difference between Rembrandt's group portraiture and Frans Hals's group portraiture. The other one that's associated with Rembrandt is Rembrandt's light. There are two terms or two things that you could be referring to when you talk about Rembrandt's light. The first is Rembrandt's lighting. If you have ever gotten a portrait taken of yourself and they arrange you against a black background with one light source that kind of comes up at your face from below, that's Rembrandt's lighting. And that's just a way of framing a portrait, or lighting, illuminating a portrait. Rembrandt's light is what I actually want to talk to you guys about, and it's Rembrandt's particular form of chiaroscuro that we're going to see. It doesn't have a fancy word like tenebrism or sfumato because he wasn't Italian, but Rembrandt's light is going to be the most accurate that we've seen any artist be able to capture. So his scenes look, maybe you could say, the most photorealistic in their color hues because of the way that he studied and perceived light. So this is a detail of the man dressed in yellow as a close-up on his spear and his clothing, because I just wanted to show you the subtle tonal changes that go across this fold of cloth right here. When we talked about chiaroscuro and we talked about Leonardo da Vinci, we discussed how chiaroscuro was the arrangement of light and shadow on a picture plane. This is a Leonardo da Vinci example that we're looking at right here. This is Lady with an Ermine. You can see that areas where he has the light hitting it are white areas. He's mixed white in with his blue, or he's applied a layer of white paint on top of the blue underpaint. Areas where he has shadow, he mixes in dark, like black or brown, to get a darker color. And we talked about how this was great because this was very accurate compared to what other artists were doing at the time. But if you ever take a painting class, you realize, or you probably were yelling at me and saying that I was lying to you because it's just not true. Light is not white. And you have to take a moment to think about that because it's a little hard to get around. But light is not white. Light, depending on the source, is tonally different. So light from the sun tends to be a very, very bright yellow. Light from a candle or a fire can be kind of orange or even red. Light from the moon is tinged with blue. And so you never really get into a situation where you have white light like this. The only light that's really purely white is fluorescent light, and that obviously didn't exist back then. So when Rembrandt goes to add differences between his areas of light and shadow, he doesn't add white to his canvas, but he'll add whatever the color, the natural color of the light that's hitting him. So this is supposed to be a scene that's illuminated at the time by sun and by fire, and so it's a very warm yellowish that he adds to his areas. You'll notice this area right here. This area right here that is not white. It's a more yellowish gold. And then areas like the one right next to it, if you recognize the shift, you can see that there's a slight indentation here, that this is a small shadow. But instead of adding gray or black to it, he's just kind of removed some of the white and added more of a yellowish saturation. It's basically the difference between tone, neutral versus cool, instead of light versus dark, and instead he's using things like bright versus dull. So what he's doing is truly innovative for the time, and it's things like this that many artists are going to try to copy from him because, as I said, he gets some of the most photorealistic effects that were possible at that time because of his study of the subtle gradation shifts in light and color. Similar to Frans Hals, Rembrandt will use choppy brush strokes where the necessity calls for it. So he realized that areas like if you look at this tassel hanging from the spear, he uses a rather choppy brushstroke, but from further away it actually enhances the texture. If it's not a random brushstroke, it's a very carefully placed one. And it enhances the texture, and it makes it look sort of more sumptuous and more real. Where you see the best evidence of the effects of Rembrandt's lighting, it really is in this area, right down here. Because this area is in shadow. It's not being directly hit by light. However, there are many elements in this shadowy area that have reflective qualities or reflective properties. And so Rembrandt is not neglecting those. In fact, he's hitting them with little dots of light speckled throughout the shadowy area so that you can still see it even though it's in the shadow, because it would have been somewhat illuminated. Same with these beads back here. Each of these beads gets a small but powerful little bead of light that hits it. So when talking about Rembrandt's Night's Watch, I want you, when thinking about the significance, to talk about the difference in the way that Rembrandt composes his group portraiture from the way that other members of the Dutch Republic during the Baroque period were constructing or characterizing their portraiture. You can also think, if you want to, in terms of a compare and contrast between Rembrandt and Rubens. And don't get the two confused. I know that their names sound similar, and they're both from the northern European region during the 17th century, but painting style-wise, they are quite different. So you have Rembrandt, who's working for the Dutch Republic, and so he, of course, is going to be specializing in portraits, whereas Rubens is working for the very Catholic area of Flanders, and so he's going to be painting Catholic images using a style that was more familiar to the Italian Baroque. So you can also think of it as a compare and contrast between the two of them. And then you should also, probably mention something about Rembrandt's light because of how influential he's going to be on other painters. You couldn't go back to the old way of chiaroscuro after Rembrandt's life. Rembrandt as an individual, Rembrandt as an artist, comes onto the Amsterdam art scene, and he hits the art market very hard. He gets a very loyal group of patrons very early on, and he has a great deal of success from a very early start. So this one was very highly lauded. He painted portraits of doctors teaching students. So this is another example of a group portraiture by Rembrandt. He did a lot of portraits for very wealthy and very well-known art patrons. And he sort of saw himself as a very... he saw himself as kind of the Dutch Michelangelo figure. Actually, I've heard people argue that he was better than Michelangelo as far as technical painting was concerned, and I guess I would have to agree. But he saw himself as being sort of Michelangelo-esque, not only in his own work, but in the way that he controlled and dominated the market in Amsterdam, which he did do. So this was done during a sort of a high point in his career. It's showing him at his studio, and he's dressed very much like a gentleman. The studio itself seems rather modest, but in the front of the canvas, in the front of the canvas that we see, he's placed a giant canvas like he's painting us, and he's the grand observer of life. And so he paints what he sees, and right now he's painting us, and we almost get the sense that he's sort of seeing through us as he's creating our portrait. Later in his career, though, however, things took a turn for the worse with Rembrandt. Rembrandt got a sort of bad reputation for being a shopaholic, and he kind of was. He spent a lot of his money and his wife's money, and at a certain point, things go sour for him, and he has a hard time selling any of his paintings. He loses popularity. His wife dies, which is very tragic for him because it seemed like they were very much in love. When you're very much in love with someone at this time in history, it can be somewhat of a liability because he and his wife had a lot of children together. I think it was something like 8. Forgive me if I'm wrong. I don't have that in my notes right now. But he and his wife had a lot of children, and he had to then support those children, and they had grown accustomed to the life of sort of gentleman comforts that he had provided for them in the early years, and he had kind of lost that as he'd fallen from favor. So towards the end of his life, he's suffering quite a bit. He's humbled quite a bit. He's still an amazing technical painter, but then to add to all of that, he starts to lose a little bit of his sight, which is quite possibly the worst thing that can happen to someone who's a painter with the skill in the eye that Rembrandt had. So here's his self-portrait early in life and later in life. And you can just see that there's something about him that's definitely changed. This portrait, by the way, is an example of Rembrandt's lighting, where you see the one dramatic light source that comes in, and it leaves him with these triangles under his eyes. It's called Rembrandt's lighting. That's a characteristic of it. If you see the triangles, you know that you're looking at Rembrandt's lighting. It's used in photography and also film on occasion. Moving on from Rembrandt, I wanted to show you guys some of the other things that were very common in Dutch Baroque painting. You're not going to see very huge altarpieces being produced. They just weren't very common. In fact, they were frowned upon in Protestant society. And so instead, the Protestants living in the Dutch Republic wanted things like landscapes. So this is extensive landscape with ruins. Landscapes like this that show off the beauty of the landscape of the Dutch Republic with some, maybe thought-provoking ruins in the front. And this is pretty much as Christian as you're ever going to get. This small little church in the background. Really not much of a Christian symbol, but it's an old Gothic church that sort of stands for when this period used to be a very thriving Gothic area as well. Gothic period referring to around 1100 to late 1200s. Obviously, at this point in time, the church would have either been abandoned or converted into a Protestant church. Jan Vermeer, everyone has heard of Jan Vermeer, or hopefully you've heard of Jan Vermeer before. He's one of the most overpriced artists to ever hit the art market, the contemporary art market. Jan Vermeer, I think we have something like 32 paintings of his in existence today, which is part of what drove the price up. They're usually, though, very small paintings of, small sort of menial domestic scenes of seemingly no consequence. And it really wasn't until, I think the 1870s that people started really to love Jan Vermeer. And at that point, his pieces started to fetch tons of money, very overpriced for what are really quite small pieces. But they are very interesting sort of vignettes or sights into what the Dutch domestic life was like. So that's an excellent sort of capture of the spirit of the time. Jan Vermeer was also, similar to Rembrandt, a master of light. He doesn't exactly use Rembrandt's lighting. Some of his light does somewhat seem artificial and white, but he's interesting in his ability to enhance the contrast between light and dark. So his scenes in general, while they look sort of mundane or everyday, they have this glittering, almost jeweled or sparkling effect because of the enhanced contrast that he uses. You'll see a better example in one of his landscape paintings. This is a domestic scene of his house with a woman, usually assumed to have been his wife, holding a guitar during some practice lessons and also holding a letter that she's just been handed by one of their house servants. So she's in the background, but included in the vignette, included in this small scene, we see all sorts of other details that seem to really have nothing to do to add to the narrative of the scene. All they do is just add to the casualty of the scene that we're looking at. So, for example, this pair of shoes on the floor sort of has a messy house. It needs to be tidied up, or maybe it was in the process of being tidied up because there's this broom sticking out in front as well. The servant, or the handmaiden who brought the letter, was probably also in the process of doing some laundry. She put her laundry down to hand the letter over. Also in the foreground, we see a bit of a messy closet over here. Some sheet music, maybe some other papers back here, a little hanging dish rag, and then the curtain that would usually keep this door closed is now open. So it's actually really neat. We almost get the effect that we are walking by this room and seeing the scene happen, that the scene wasn't composed for us. Although we know for a fact that Vermeer composed all of his scenes very meticulously. He was just really good. He had a great eye for these sort of seemingly mundane compositions that would just look strikingly beautiful because of the way that he painted them, because of the way that the light was hitting them. One of the things that Vermeer might have done to get the amount of realism in things like the perspective that he uses and the light contrast that he uses, people have suggested that he used a primitive version of the camera called a camera obscura, which was just becoming popular at the time. Now, the camera obscura was not technically a camera in that it did not produce a permanent image, but it would reflect a permanent image onto a screen if you looked through this box, and you could kind of trace that screen. So people think that he might have used that because things like his linear perspective are so technically accurate. You can see in the floor tiles here, he loved these black and white square tiles to really show off his linear perspective, and as they get flatter, as they recede into space, and then this fireplace back here as well. Oh, this is Delft. That's where he lived, if you're interested in going to Delft, which I did, which is fun. This is another one of his very much loved paintings. We think that it's as close to a self-portrait as we have of Vermeer, because we have a man in the foreground who's painting this woman in the background. So an allegory of the art of painting, a painter looking at his own practice. This is again his studio with the black and white floor, and you can see that he very carefully poses most of his subjects in front of this window. You see almost all of his scenes take place in his studio, where he paints individuals, and he'll arrange them with different objects behind them, but they always have this very bright light shining in from the window. And all of his bright lights and whites have this sort of glittering, almost jewel-like quality to his pieces because of the high contrast that he's using. And then this is, The Girl with the Pearl Earring, if you ever read that book, or I think it's also a movie. Not a really consequential painting, sort of similar to the Mona Lisa, I guess. She has this sort of interesting facial expression that she's making. We know because of her shirt that she was a servant, because that's the color shirt that the servants wore. We saw in the letter that that's the shirts that his servants wore specifically. But the turban she's wearing is not traditional, and certainly how would a servant get such a large pearl earring like that? So the mystique around her is really what's made this a very famous piece. And then also, it's a Vermeer, so it's going to be very expensive for that reason as well. The Dutch Republic also really liked moralizing paintings, so paintings that tell you some sort of tale. They really haven't lost that since the last chapter we talked about at the 16th century, when we talked about the Netherlandish proverbs. Jan Steen was a famous moralizing cartoonist. Jan Steen started out as a cartoonist and then made the switch over to painting for some of his very well-loved cartoons. He would commemorate them in oil paint. So this is the Feast of St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas is basically Christmas, right? We know that basically pretty much started in Dutch. In the Dutch Republic, and the children would wake up every morning or on St. Nicholas Day, and they would have gifts in their shoes if they were good girls and boys, and if they were bad girls and boys, they would have coal in their shoes. So you have this little girl was obviously a very good little girl because she has a doll that she's just removed from her shoe. This little boy in the background is crying, and his sister's making fun of him because he has coal in his shoes, so he was not a good boy, so he doesn't have anything. So it's just, again, the Dutch are interested in contemporary scenes of their modern life and moralizing themes. They're not interested in big themes of Christianity. So, yes, technically it's a Christian holiday that we're looking at, but we don't have the big angels coming in like we do in the Baroque period. The Dutch also really love painting still life images. It was kind of the way that they practiced for the realism when they did portraits. I mean, how do you get good at painting fabric? You practice painting fabric. How do you get good at painting flowers in someone's hair? You practice painting flowers in a still life. Flowers are particularly hard to paint in a still life because they die very quickly. So a painting like this by Rachel Ruysch would have taken her a very long time to produce, and so the flowers would obviously die before she were finished. So you do it half from life and then half from memory. When last we looked at Spain and the art of Spain, we were discussing the Counter-Reformation movement in Spain known as the Inquisition, and we were talking about the Caravaggiosti, who were very popular in Spain at the time, showing scenes of martyrdom and drama, and basically very Italian-looking Baroque pieces. Diego Velázquez, though, I held off on speaking about him, and I pushed him to the end of the discussion of the Dutch Baroque, because Diego Velázquez is going to bring realistic subject matter, realistic lighting, and realistic perspective to Spain, and he's going to actually be one of the most influential Spanish painters from the 17th century all the way through to contemporary times. One of the most well-loved Spanish painters. So he's going to start the movement of painting scenes of everyday life, similar to what the Dutch were doing, despite the fact that he's painting for Spain, which was obviously a very Catholic and still is a very Catholic country. He paints scenes of contemporary modern life, historical scenes like this surrender of Breda, one of the few battles from the 30 Years' War that Spain managed to win. So you have the surrendering party over here, you've got the victorious Spanish general over here with his followers behind him, and then way off in the distance in the background here, using aerial perspective as things get hazy towards the background, you have the battle scene kind of cooling off. But it's this piece that I have starred. This is Las Meninas, also known as the Maids of Honor, but everyone calls it Las Meninas. It is Baroque and it is from Spain, but stylistically I would put it more on par with the Dutch Baroque in the way that it approaches painting. Diego Velázquez is going to use Rembrandt's light, and also in the way that it approaches its subject matter. Diego Velázquez really likes to use these everyday scenes, these casual, informal everyday scenes. You see references to Rembrandt all over this painting. Remember, we just looked at that picture of Rembrandt where he was standing as the painter of the world, the observer of the world, and all we had was a giant canvas with his back to us. Here's Diego Velázquez's giant red canvas, or giant canvas that we're looking at. This is Velázquez. He paints himself in the portrait. The painting itself, it's kind of interesting because it's a painting of Velázquez painting a painting, and it's called Las Meninas, so it's called the Maids of Honor. This little girl right here, this very adorable little blonde, is Princess Marguerite. She's the princess, the daughter of the King and Queen of Spain. So these are her meninas. These are her maids of honor on either side. This is her favorite dwarf. That's her, I think it's her little brother kicking a dog. Someone snack that kid. It's a painting of them, but that's actually not who Velázquez is painting within the painting. He's painting what he's looking at. And what he's looking at you can see because of this use of a mirror. Last time we saw a mirror like this utilized to open the space up, we were talking about the Dutch art, Dutch portraiture from the 16th century. So you can definitely see where he owes a great debt of gratitude to 16th century northern art in using this mirror to open up the scene. So in this mirror you can see the King and Queen of Spain that he's getting ready to paint within his portrait. There are multiple layers and meanings to this painting, and there are definitely multiple references to the act of painting. So he's working on a painting. The painting is of the King and Queen, but the title of the painting is actually of Las Meninas, who's the little princess here is getting ready to be painted. And then at the same time you have things like these great background canvases, which are paintings themselves included within the painting. So you could just go on and on into the multiple references to the act of painting here. He's really making a statement about himself in the end, that he's painting such great scenes. A detail of the little Princess Marguerite shows the debt of gratitude that Velázquez owes to the Dutch Republic's Baroque movement. You see his use of Rembrandt's light, and you also see his technique of using a bristly brushstroke that's very visible, but very purposefully so, especially in things like her locks of hair. You see her little hair wispies that look and behave very much like real hair, even though they were created by one single brushstroke, especially up at the top here, where it's folded into her bun. So he owes much to Dutch portraiture and to Rembrandt specifically, which is why I included him at the end of the Dutch Republic. We're going to end our discussion of Chapter 3 with Diego Velázquez and pick back up. We're going to jump ahead a couple of chapters and reconvene at Chapter 30 for our next lecture.